Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the 10 Laws Podcast with East Forest. I am Mr. East Forest. Thank you for joining us. This week, I have a conversation with Dr. Monique Andrews. Dr. Mo is someone that I met at Esalen at our last retreat there. Dr. Mo was attending, and we got to talking and found out that they're a longtime student and teacher in embodied neuroscience and chiropractic and Eastern spiritual practices, where she presents a unique perspective, blending modern tools with ancient wisdom, drawing on years of intensive study. She's been an expert in embodied somatic practices, and that's what it says on her website. And that's what I gleaned from when we were talking. So I think this is an interesting conversation because it's a lot about, again, the body and inner knowledge and inner work, and how we grow and learn. So I'm sure that you are going to enjoy it. I just got down to southern Utah for the first time since last fall. I've been away all winter. There are big changes here afoot for me, and that I have to move from where I'm been planting myself for the last 5-6 years, and definitely a lot of grief coming up with that. And I had a rough week. I think that on top of a bunch of other stuff going on in my life and in work, it was a lot to handle. And sometimes that happens, right? You feel overwhelmed, the anxiety starts to build, you get into a bit of a snowball, and it's hard to see the light through all of that. And when I drove down here a couple days ago, it was a full moon. And Radha said, you know what, I think this would be a great time to engage in a journey. And a lot of times when someone says that, or you're thinking that, and you're in a state where maybe that would help you, sometimes you just don't want to. You're resisting everything. And it's also not convenient. It takes time and you have to prepare. But I was driving down and I thought, all right, I really need some help. So when I got here, I got things as set up as I could. It was super cold out when I arrived. And right as I arrived, the moon was rising over the sandstone, and it looked like one of those huge Horizon Return of the Jedi full moons, and it felt like this very auspicious sign. And I did dive into the journey space and really worked with an intention around sort of resiliency, that warrior energy, and what that is. And if I had to have any takeaway from that whole experience, it would be that, it's just immediately I started thinking, oh man, it's all about the music. It's easy to get wrapped up in all these details, and I've almost forgotten about the thing itself. Not forgotten, but lost my way a bit about what is the trunk, the roots of this tree. And it's all about the music because it's all about what's coming through music and art and creativity, and that remembrance and reminder it gives not just me, but all of us who are experiencing it and listening at the same time. It's a shared experience of remembrance. And that was really, really powerful. And helped to realign me. And now still have lots of these stresses. I still have to move from where I am. It's still a huge pain in the ass. And there's still a lot of grief. But it's giving me a bit more perspective. And I feel the temperature lowering, at least in my body. And I think that's what a lot of this work is about. It's not that you're in this Pollyannish state where it's changing. You're like, oh, that's not happening now, or I just feel love and light, or I'm all better now. It's like, no, those things are still there, but maybe the temperature is lower. Maybe I feel a little more groundedness or perspective. And hey, these things come and go, right? They ebb and flow. It's like waves. So I don't expect that I won't feel anxious again in the future. But we got to remember what our toolkits are, remember where we can lean and where we can garner counsel and support. And it's all around us and from our loved ones and our friends. So don't forget to lean on folks and ask for help. People love to help, generally speaking. They love to be useful and purposeful. So it's always okay to ask your friends for help. So when I woke up in the morning, that beautiful full moon, wouldn't you know it, was setting on the other side of the horizon. And there was the truth moon going down, revealing to me my truth. I'm going to be playing at the Bottle Rock Festival in Napa, California at the end of May. That is the next event that I have coming up. And we might be working on kind of a panel discussion sort of meditative event as well, right after Memorial Day. So stay tuned for that, also in the Bay Area. So get on our mailing list. That's always the best way to know what's going on. eastforest.org, or of course, social media, East Forest Instagram, and East Forest Music on the other platforms. I don't know. I could blither and blather about other things happening, going on, but we should get into this because this is a great conversation with our friend, Dr. Monique Andrews. Monique, thank you for taking the time. Nice to see you.
Thanks. Pretty excited to chat with you today, actually. Been a fan for a long time, so I'll try to keep the fangirling to a minimum, but, not going to lie.
Oh, well, we met at Esalen. You were at the one of the, was it the last one or the time before?
Yeah, the one in December.
They're all one giant retreat to me. But we had a great time, and it was great to cross paths. Did you go there much to Esalen? Was that your first time? Or
No, I've been there once before. It's such an incredible space, and just the energy is amazing, right?
Yeah. It's you always think like the land is nice, and then every time I go back, it's unreal. Like it's like the nicest. I always say that garden they have is hands down the most expensive real estate for a garden anywhere on the planet, and the best looking garden. Yeah, I mean, what a view.
Yeah, when you drive down the one on the coast, sometimes you see cows like out on a cliffside right at the ocean. I'm like,
they have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. They have the life.
Yep.
Well, when you were there, you mentioned to me that you were like a cross section between sound and neuroscience, and then I started like looking at your world in general. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's sort of like some interest of yours about pain, I'm thinking here, with polyvagal and stress.
Yeah,
trauma,
I mean,
a lot of things.
A lot of things. I think there's certainly we have an intersection there. My specialty really is in embodied neuroscience, and what interests me in particular is like how do we teach people to better regulate their experience, their body, their physiology through things like somatic practices, breath work, music. We sort of here we are in this installation of this physical being, and it doesn't come with the user's manual. And it can be pretty confounding at times.
Yeah, I actually was just talking about this on the last episode with my experience in a darkness retreat, and my big revelation through it was essentially the power and value of somatic work for myself, at least. I'm guessing for a lot of us. And I know, at least speaking for myself, that, a lot of us have I have like a mental approach to the world often. And I grew up that way, sort of reductionist and materialist with my father. And I think my way through things. And it doesn't usually, that has value. Thinking is important, but it doesn't seem to serve me well. And I started seeing some things around like in my life around pain too, especially that would come up. And anyway, I'm really starting to look under the hood here from a somatic angle. So I'd like to learn more about like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I recognize that like our bodies have been around a long time. And even before we were fully Homo sapiens, billions of years. And so there's a technology there and a knowledge that I think it's almost like the obvious is the most devious. But how can we get, like, do you agree with me? Or do you think that somatic work is a key to a certain kind of lock?
Yeah, no, I think somatic work is essential. Like we've all experienced when we like can't get out of our heads, right? Like you can't shift your perspective no matter what. Like, and most of the world, I think you could agree that you and I and people that are sort of floating in this realm, like most of the world believe what they think.
Sure.
Like it's they think.
And beliefs are like something, it's almost like you'd think you didn't choose it or pick it. It's like, no, that is. And it's like, well, it is something that you choose to hold. But yeah, beliefs are a problem.
It believes the mind is a confounding conspiracy that is, I think, coalesced from all of our experiences in our life. And how does that work? What's the problem? And essentially, when you have any experience in life, your nervous system has three primary states of being that you can go to. Connection, right? We want to be with others. There's a danger, we mobilize. That's the fight or flight response, right? That most people are familiar with. And then if we become, if there's a life threat, we drop into immobilization. And so there's sort of these three primary modes of being. And, we've all had that friend who's like, man, I wish they would just chill out. Like they're always hyper vigilant. And what I've come to learn is that our physiology, it's not our fault. Again, it's based on this coalescence of all of our past experience. Yeah. And let me give you an example. Like, let's say you hear a car backfire. You jump, right? By the time you have a conscious awareness of what happened, you've already had a response. So there's your physiology kind of goes into overdrive. It creates a behavior. We have emotions about that, like, holy crap, what just happened? And then your mind wants to create a narrative, and that's the normal process. But what's happened is the more modern life has accumulated stressors and traumas and laid on experience, we tend to hang out in one of these platforms more than others. And really, they should all be available to us at all times. And so we kind of get stuck. We get stuck, and it gets stuck in our bodies.
But do you think that's a modern affliction? Because I also just kind of wonder, like, we have such wisdom in the body. Why is it that it's getting stuck, or things like, why do traumas not get fully processed in a certain way, and it causes so many disparate problems down the line?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, because this is something that I've been diving into really deeply. Like, why is it that trauma gets encoded in the body?
Right, exactly.
And really, it's a survival mechanism. So what happens when we have a trauma or like a difficult experience? Because for some people, they hear the word trauma and it's like big T trauma, domestic violence, war. But trauma can be, a loss of a parent, a dissolution of a partnership, what have you. Traumas don't have to be some, big thing. But they are. I don't want to minimize it. But when you have a trauma, what happens is your brain sort of drops into survival mode. And when it does that, we take that sort of thinking, executive functioning, reasoning part of your mind out of the picture. That's the prefrontal cortex. I don't want to get too jargony, but that thinking part of our mind is not the most important part. We want to drop down into the amygdala, into that survival, those subcortical structures, because what do you want? You want to be able to respond quickly. If there's a tiger chasing you, you don't want to think about it. You just want your body to do something. Mm-hmm. And that's a normal process. But what happens then is when you have trauma, it doesn't get encoded as an explicit memory in the mind. It actually gets stored in the body. And oftentimes it gets trapped there if you don't find a way to discharge that. And so then when something comes up to trigger in the future, what happens is you don't remember it as a past event. It feels like you're experiencing it now. You see this a lot in people with PTSD. It's like, because your limbic system, that part of your survival brain that you drop into, it actually can't tell time. And so when you're triggered, it feels like you're in it real time. You're having that same experience. And so in conventional medicine in the last, since Freud in the 1800s, there's been more of this focus on talk therapy. And there's this great quote by Bessel van der Kolk, I'm going to butcher it, but essentially says that the rational mind is impotent to change what's happening in our emotional experience. Like, we can't talk ourselves out of this shit that's happening in our bodies. And it gets trapped. And so we have to find ways to get out of there.
Are you familiar with the Shakers? They're like, I think, an offshoot of the Quakers. You ever heard of these cats? So I had so they shake. Just that, I think it maybe it's sort of like Sufi spin the shakers would shake. I'm also bastardizing this, but I say this because I had an experience with mushrooms once where my buddy was really going through a hard time, and I said I'd sit with him. This is back in 2010 or something, 2011. I was really in a deep depression myself, really struggling. And we get into the journey, and I noticed I'm just sitting there with him, and I felt like a tremor in my legs. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to let this shake for a while. Just let it shake. And I started shaking, just sitting there and shaking for a while. And I felt I had gone through a really difficult bicycle accident twice. This was the second time. And, you fall on your bike, horribly broke my arm, and you're just lying there. And then an ambulance comes. They put you on a stretcher. They take you in a hospital. You go to do surgery. And you never move, really. And all this stuff was stored up in me, but I didn't understand it. I couldn't think about it, but it was in there. And I just noticed that after this journey and this shaking session, I kind of I did turn a corner. That was a turning point. I slowly started to come out of depression weeks upon weeks. And looking back on it, I was like, maybe those shakers, because I heard about these folks, they're onto something. I wonder too if the Quakers, I'm serious, the Quakers used to quake more. And that kind of, it's a vestige maybe that got dropped, and now they sit in that beautiful silence. But anyway, there's something about shaking, like animals do that. Dogs do it all the time. They get a little spooked, they just shake it off, and they're good. And you see an animal, a cheetah's chased, a cheetah's usually chasing. And if they get away, they shake.
Yep.
So what happened to us? Why don't we know how to shake anymore?
Well, actually, what you've described is what is the third and normal stage of a traumatic event. So whenever you have trauma, there's three things that are supposed to happen right away. Well, not right away, but in this process. Number one, you become aroused. So your brain goes on high alert. Your amygdala, things get smoky, and your brain's like, what's going on? And then you mobilize. You create a response to it. And then the third thing that's supposed to happen is discharge. Literally, you shake it off. And you're right. You see animals do it all the time. But what happens with humans, I think, maybe more so than other species, because of our thinking mind, we create these narratives around the experience, and we tend to re-trigger. Anyway, things get stuck in the body. And we're not getting to that stage of discharge because people are getting stuck in this danger, fight or flight response. And we don't get there. And the Sufis, the shakers, pendulation. This is something that you see little autistic kids doing this, or it's actually a strategy that's used in somatic experiencing, pendulation, right? We've all had that trip experience where it's like, man, I just can't stop doing this. I've recently added more movement to my meditation practice, and I actually feel like I'm getting deeper.
Wow, it's crazy to say that. I noticed that I do that when I play music in certain moments. I find myself doing that. I love that term, pendulation. It feels like a wave, right? And in essence, all of life and existence in this dimension is a form of a wave, a I'm not trying to be hippie, but it literally is atoms moving around. Everything's in some kind of oscillation and movement. And so in some ways, a lot of this is about stagnation versus flow, if I'm trying to reduce it. But what are the ways, or are there ways that we can help that flow happen so things don't get stuck in the first place?
Yeah, I think number one, as I said, my sort of mission has been, how can we teach people to better regulate their state, right? We are all responsible for our mode of being in the world. So if we can take some responsibility for learning to regulate better. Now, here's the cool thing. This is what I think. This is what I was so excited to talk to you about, actually. And I think that music, like trauma, gets stored in the body. And actually, the science reflects this. So when people talk about trauma, oftentimes the word that you hear them discuss is trigger. Oh, I got triggered, or this triggered me, or that triggered me. And in fact, we know, just as I said earlier, when somebody gets triggered, something, it actually brings you back into that state. You feel like you're there. We see this really bad, in PTSD and war vets. There's another word that's the flip side of a trigger, and that is a glimmer. Which is what is something that brings you into this, compressed, contracted state, it actually brings you into an elevated state of being. I think music like trauma gets stored in the body.
That doesn't sound good.
No, I think it's good.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit then.
Yeah. Like, like we all have that piece of music that just like elevates us. Many of us have had a trip where, we later listen to the music and it's like, I remember the music from my very first trip. I still listen to it and I feel an elevated state of being.
Right.
It functions like a glimmer. And I think some of that has to do with, it impacts similar parts of the brain. So, for example, this is really cool. Your brain uses a surveillance system all the time to determine if your environment is safe or unsafe. It's called neuroception. So all the time your brain is like, is this environment safe? Is what's going into my body safe? Is this person that I'm talking to, is this safe or unsafe? And then from that determination, from this neuroception, what it does is it creates a series of changes in your body. It creates a physiological behavioral response that is in relation to its surveillance. And what we found is that there are specific acoustic frequencies that trigger an emotional experience, and that is paralleled in the autonomic nervous system. Let me just explain.
Okay. I'll ask questions afterwards.
Yeah. So and this isn't evolutionary. This happened as the nervous system evolved, and you see it in a particular way in humans in particular, because we are the only, apparently, species that can reflect on self, right?
Allegedly.
That's what I'm saying.
Maybe dolphins, maybe all, but it's looking like maybe elephants, octopus.
We have these really big prefrontal cortices that apparently
we're different.
We're different.
Yeah.
So we evolved. This is kind of cool. In fact, there's an argument of which type of communication evolved first, language or music, right? Do you know about this?
No, but it would seem music in the broader sense. I mean, everything from birds to whales. I mean, it's the substrate of language, right? Sound.
Well, this is obvious to you. The linguists will say language happened first, and the musicologists will say music happened first.
I don't know. I mean, it depends how you define music, I guess. But yeah.
This is what I've been reading.
But music, I mean, not to go on a side thing, but it's like, it's crazy. It's almost like it's fundamental in some weird way to the human experience, like what it is and how we interact with it, the way we understand it. It's a reflection of math, which is just the building blocks of the universe, but that math somehow we interpret it in a way that it unlocks feeling and emotion, memory, perhaps as you're saying, much more. And why does that work for us? We take it for granted, but it's extremely powerful.
And I think in some senses it probably works for other species. I mean, other species don't create, and what I'm hearing from you is that there's like we could think about music in a lot of ways, like birds make music,
Mm-hmm.
But from an evolutionary perspective, so when there are certain acoustic frequencies that make your nervous system do different things. So for example, sort of really low frequencies that are sort of more guttural in nature, it sounds like a predator sound, like a growl. And that tends to send the nervous system into a state of that brain says, danger. And if we go on the other end and go to really sort of shrill, high acoustic frequencies, that sounds life-threatening. And most nervous systems will not find that appealing. It'll actually create a sense of irritation. And you sort of drop into an emotional state that is paralleled with the nervous system strategy. And this is not my theory. This is all outlined in the science. And you see this in kids. It's why most children, except for those really in the neurodivergent spectrum, will experience this tone, the sound of their mother's voice as soothing. That's in the mid acoustic frequency range.
Right.
And it triggers a whole series of physiology, behavioral responses. That's all part of an evolutionary plan. Like it works really, really well. So when
That's also why we can pick up on those upper mids for speech, just to like hear each other. I mean, that's why like when you're making music, tiny adjustments in the upper mids and mid range make a huge difference to our ear.
Yeah.
You know.
And so here's just to take that to another super nerd level, and that is the same neural mechanisms that are creating the physiological response in our autonomic nervous system to do things like bring you into sympathetic or to help you relax, also innervate structures in the face, the larynx, the ears that control things like prosody, tone, pitch, voice, how you attenuate sounds or not. So they did studies looking at middle ear attenuation of those low guttural sounds or those shrill sounds. And we actually try and tune them out because they create a response in the body.
Wow. So is there a connection between music and the release of trauma or working with trauma? Have you found anything there?
Oh yeah, so they're doing interesting. It's not so much been used in trauma, but there's been a lot of research that's done in autism, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the interesting thing with kids that are neurodivergent and a lot of autistic kids is the part of their auditory cortex, so that part of your brain that sort of interprets the sound you're experiencing, is not very well connected to the reward center. Okay? So like they don't, for example, hear the sound of their mother's voice as soothing because what would normally happen is the auditory cortex is processing that information at the same time. It's attached to the limbic system. It's attached to an area called the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for signaling reward. You get an increase in dopamine, right? People know about dopamine. We also get increases in oxytocin. We don't see that in certain populations, in people that have PTSD, severe trauma, autism, et cetera. And what we're finding is that because music, in the right acoustic frequencies, obviously, music certainly like yours, what it does is it naturally increases dopamine in that area in the nucleus accumbens. It naturally increases oxytocin, right? Oxytocin, people know what that is. That's like the love hormone that also gets elevated when we take psychedelics. And so, but what the research shows is you can start to use music to kind of like help move that adaptive nervous system response along when it's like somehow been compromised either through maladaptive neuroplastic changes or non-typical sequential neurodevelopment, as you see in neurodivergent kids like that have autism, that we can use music to create brain changes that we haven't been able to do with things like talk therapy.
Well, it sounds like it's helpful if it has a bit of guidance. You know, I think about, for instance, let's talk about MDMA. You can take MDMA on your own and stumble into this or that or not. What I'm trying to say is, but if you're in a therapeutic setting and you have the guidance of a particular therapist, let's say a couples therapy on MDMA, you now have pretty good ability to stay on track and like go a little this way. No, don't go that way. Okay, yeah, go into that. Same with music. Like we use it in some ways without knowing what we're doing or very unconsciously. And perhaps if it brought a bit of a consciousness to it or using it more as a tool, it's like it could be quite effective in some of these ways. But, you know, we need maybe a little guidance to do so.
Yeah, I think so. And it's happening at a level below the level of consciousness, which I think is beautiful. And it's why we can be transported in time when we hear a song that maybe we haven't heard for a long time. And like it takes over your body. It's what I mean when I say I think music is kind of like trauma, but like in a good way, where it is encoded in our bodies and it creates these changes that are actually measurable. And this is something that has evolved with the advent of like neuroimaging in the last 20 years. We can now use fMRI to see changes in these different areas and how they're connected and how that can be elevated through things like somatic work, through music. And then what if we combine those things together, right? Like put psychedelics and music together. I think that you see, certainly I've experienced changes that are like you couldn't imagine. I have somebody very close to me. I don't want to disclose who it is, but she had an experience with MDMA. So before this, so there was some childhood trauma. She never found music enjoyable. Didn't like to listen at all.
Wow.
Yeah. Didn't like to listen to music. Didn't like whistling, no humming. No music. And I'm like, what? It's such a fundamental part of my life. One MDMA experience, and all of a sudden she's making playlists and listening to music. And
what kind of MDMA experience? Like casual or someone kind of like ceremonial? I was going to add that like ceremony itself is a form of guidance. That's what I forgot to say before.
Small group ceremony.
Okay.
And it radically transformed her lived experience in the world. Suddenly, she has an interest in music. Suddenly, Bon Iver is no longer annoying. Now I want to listen to Holocene 20 times.
Was there a form of release during that experience or anything sort of on the surface that would indicate some, something
No,
changing?
Other than, we have epic playlists with lots of East Forest and other great music.
So connection to music in the experience. And music, MDMA is good at, you can look at difficult things and not be triggered by them. So the music wasn't triggering and then able to connect with it in a sense?
I think so, because I believe, and this was her first MDMA experience, I believe what happens, we know that when you take psychedelics, it suppresses that output of the amygdala, right? Which is our fear response center. So the amygdala is this key part of the limbic system, that emotional part of our brain. That's the smoke alarm. And what we know psychedelics does is it actually decreases blood flow to the amygdala. It turns down the fear center of the brain. And then there had to be neuroplastic change. Like there had to be new connections made in that experience, because it was a mind-blowing shift. And I've never read anything else like it. And I think you hear about people's experience with psychedelics and music. Like I can't imagine a psychedelic experience without music. Have you ever had a psychedelic experience without music?
It wasn't good. One of the worst in my life. Yeah, pre-East Forest, which was 2008, I was essentially chasing an experience I had in, when was this? 1996, my first experience in college with mushrooms. And I basically, my first experience was very positive. And thank God, I took mushrooms, one of these things, you just hear about it, you're like, I'm going to do this. And it was a big party outside. And I started getting real confused. And I was at first just joking with my friends. And I walked down, there were these cherry blossom trees. And they were in bloom, which now sounds like an allergic nightmare. But at the time, I lay down under them and the cherry blossoms were falling on me as time slipped away, as my ego slipped away, all the classic stuff, ego death. And thank God I was alone too. Thank God it was like transcendently beautiful as opposed to scary and traumatic. But that experience had no music. So there's probably music actually in the background from the stage. So I'll say there was music.
Yeah.
And I was chasing that experience for many, many years. And chasing it in a sense of what was that? Like that was the most important thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Everyone needs to experience whatever the hell that is. I have no elders. I have no books. I have no podcasts at the time, no real internet really. And I didn't understand it, but it was very inspiring. And so I started to sort of reverse engineer it until later I thought, what if I had a couple other experiences, 2 or 3, with music and mushrooms that combined in a way that I was like, there's something there. The music can help me get back to that thing. I felt that infinite space. And so now here we are, 15, 20 years later, and I absolutely, because then I started going to other ceremonies and indigenous ceremonies, and they all of them used music as the primary vehicle to guide a journey. And in some ways, even like the mechanism that is bringing the spirit forth the way it's described in some cultures is profound. And so now I'm like the guy trying to wave my arms saying, why aren't we talking about music more in this quote unquote psychedelic revolution? Because it's not a side story. It's like, and very exciting to think like, well, what can we do with modern music and make some really amazing art that's intentional for this space? Not just like it happens to work well, but it's like, what if you turned the dial to like, I'm going to actually make this for this experience? So
yes,
that's my way of saying yes.
yes,
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, there's something very primal about it, and in fact, I think maybe one of the reasons why they're not looking closer at music is because they don't really quite understand what's happening that well yet. We do understand things about what happens in different brain areas with music, and that is enhanced even further with psychedelics. It's like those same similar brain areas, and we measure neurochemistry, hormones like oxytocin, dopamine, all of these things, right? And even fMRI studies. Robin Carhart Harris has done some amazing work in that regard. Here's another cool nugget I think you'll love. And that is when they look at these changes in brain chemistry, if you look at people singing alone versus singing in a group, and then the third, which is improvising. And this made me think about our experience at Esalen. And that actually the positive changes in chemistry and blood flow are elevated as we go through that process. So you see increases from non-singing to one person singing by themselves to maybe people singing in a chorus. But when people are improvising in music, it's elevated even higher.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Improvising's the thing. I mean, it really is. Because it's magic.
It is magic, but it made me think
play,
about...
right? It's play. Making things. Anybody can do it. Anyone can improvise singing, whether you think it's good or bad. I mean, any human
we all
can
do it in the shower, and play can only happen when we feel safe. Which brings our conversation full circle back to your autonomic nervous system state, determining your experience, your lived experience in the world. Play is sort of a hybrid state between that super elevated, what we call social engagement, and fight or flight. Because in a way, there has to be a level of activation and mobilization to play, right? So that's sort of somewhere in between social engagement and this fight or flight. But because there's safety, it's actually an elevated state. It's what is referred to in polyvagal theory as a hybrid state. And it's beautiful. The other part of that is bliss. Stephen Porges, who created polyvagal theory, he went and he studied the yogis. It's like if an animal is immobilized, that is a life-threatening situation. And they measured something called heart rate variability. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically it's the interval between our heartbeats. And heart rate variability is used in science and conventional medicine as a measure of overall health. Higher the heart rate variability, the higher you're expressing health. That's a more elevated state. And typically when you see people that are mobilized, they'll have low heart rate variability, except these gurus, these yogis, mobilized for hours at a time, but with really high heart rate. That's bliss. This is another one of those hybrid states. But music can do the same thing. The Sufi dance, church organs, music like yours elevates people's, hey, that would be a cool experiment. Let's do a East Forest concert and check people's heart rate variability. I would bet a lot of money that the HRV would be elevated.
Maybe we can get like Fitbit or Apple Watch to sponsor it, and we'll aggregate the data in real time, and it will affect like the lighting or
not
some visuals.
Sexy, but it would push that conversation. I
love it.
Yeah, it's super cool.
Yeah. So let's go back then to like, I'm sure I have some questions and maybe people have questions about like, okay, this is sort of making sense, but what could I do on a personal level, assuming that we all have various forms of traumas or like you said, things that have happened to us and that's not our fault, but perhaps all these different experiences are stored up in our body. There might be a level of stuckness. And have you discovered things that might help? Like maybe we can get a little more specific
Yeah.
about somatic work or something otherwise.
Yeah.
And what
So
that means.
definitely lots of different types of somatic work. And it's really the key is finding something that works for you. I think having a facilitator is important. And I also think getting people to develop like a daily self-practice where they are using breath work in combination with some movements to sort of help to change their state. We know that you can do that. You know, most people are probably familiar with box breathing, right? Where you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. It's called box breathing. I teach applied polyvagal, which is like, how do we use these exercises, these polyvagal exercises, to stimulate the vagus nerve, which brings up parasympathetic tone. It creates that sense of calm in the body. It elevates the physiology in a way that we feel safe. It's very simple. It's not complicated, but most people, like anything, if they don't know how you can't do it. So we have to get people access to that kind of information.
Is there a through line here? Like it's different modalities that have to do with feeling as opposed to thinking?
100%. In fact, we work through the body to change our physiology. And when you change the physiology, you change the emotional response. And that allows us to change the narrative in our mind, right? Because normally what happens is we feel something in our body, right? Let's say, but you have butterflies before you're going on stage, right? You have a feeling in your tummy.
I have been feeling that for 20 plus years. It's a familiar and not fun feeling. Yeah.
And what if you change the narrative about that? What if it wasn't, crap, I feel really anxious and nervous, to I'm super excited about this experience? Because I'll tell you, that's what I do. I do a lot of speaking around the world. And when I have to get up on some of these big stages, it would be like, same thing. You got like, ah. And it's like, for me, I'm like, I am so excited.
Getting juiced.
I'm getting
primed.
Juiced.
Yeah, getting a little, the body's getting ready. Let's do this.
What's the narrative? You can change the narrative. And sometimes this is where the facilitator can come in and like just turn the coin and be like, well, what if the narrative is this instead? But the physiology changes first. It's more impactful working through the body to change the physiology, which changes the emotion, which allows us to change the narrative about it. The narrative comes last.
Right. So it's not so much about what we just did where you tell me something and I think about it and I say, okay, I'm changing it. So the way to change the narrative through the body, am I correct that you're getting into a state of spaciousness where you can feel and give space and time for that feeling to exist? And then I assume that the changing of that narrative is through, like it's a natural process through feeling. Like, because where's the line where it just becomes you thinking your way through it or you're deciding with your brain?
Well, sometimes we can think our way through things, but it's very hard when we're in a compressed or contracted emotional state like depression or anxiety.
Yes, because you distorted cognitive view.
The rational mind is impotent to talk yourself out of an emotionally negative state.
Oh, I'm good at that. I'm good at the negative states.
So if we can change the physiology to take us out of those lower states, if we can elevate parasympathetic tone, if we can elevate the physiology, then it literally feels better in our body, and it will shift the emotional perspective to a more positive result. And that in and of itself creates changes in brain chemistry and physiology.
But you're also sort of speaking to, I think, sort of like the body as a brain in a way. Like it's not just everything goes back to Rome, which is the brain. I'm hearing you say like that the memory is encoded in the body and that the changes, not just neuroplasticity in the brain, but there's something neuroplastic in the body.
I think, well, for me, I don't really have a dualistic perspective. I think mind, body, brain, body, it all works together. But when I talk about working through the body, I mean like from below the thinking mind down. Okay? Because like, for example, I mentioned earlier in humans, this whole prefrontal cortex idea, like I don't want to get into a whole conversation about where does consciousness reside, but whether you think we could, right?
Sure.
two prevailing theories of consciousness. The cognitive neuroscientists think that the brain is a lump of meat and it produces consciousness. Like if you didn't like that's where consciousness is only present in the brain, that the brain makes it. And then there are other people like me, and I imagine you probably fall into this camp where you believe that consciousness is in the field and the brain is a conduit. We experience consciousness and the brain interprets it. Just like our ears are responsible for interpreting sound, but they're not the sound, right? The notes are not the music. I just lost my train of thought.
Perfect. See, that's a good example. Now you've entered the zone. I guess I'm picking apart though for my own reasons about because it's kind of ironic. I'm trying to understand, if I'm crossing a line, like, am I serving my body in the right way to do the somatic work? I just started working with a somatic therapist, and I've only done a handful of sessions, but they've been oddly powerful. And I say odd because I'm confused at times. Like, why am I crying? Yeah. Why? How did I get to these states? And then I'm done. And of course, my brain has this thought like, well, is that even useful? And now what? Like, is that useful to feel all those things? And I of course, I know it is. But I'm trying to say, I also don't really understand what this process is. And it's a bit confounding.
Yeah, because it's never been described that way. I believe, and a lot of science is reflecting this, that your body is a storehouse for every experience you've ever had.
Oh my God, that's a lot of experiences.
And if we just know how to ask the body the questions, the answers will come. And the mind, which is presumably a function of the brain, is, it's like ego. I think for me, mind ego is kind of the same thing, where it's a great servant and a terrible master. Like you can think yourself into a very big mess. You can also think yourself into great, scenarios. But I believe that we can use the body to deconstruct experiences that we can't do with our mind in a way that is constructive, I guess, for lack of a better word. Like the mind is not always, doesn't have your best interest at heart. Your mind is a confluence of things you learned and the hallucination of our cognitive systems that want to create a picture, right? Like, what's the job of something like the default mode is to suppress entropy. Your mind wants the world to make sense. It doesn't mean it's right.
It's almost like the body is the bridge to the unconscious, subconscious in a way, because we're often identifying so much with the conscious level, and we need to access the unconscious, subconscious, just sort of like these deeper cognitive levels that have so much of that autonomous stuff that you're talking about. That is really, maybe it's like the iceberg just poking out of the water. And it's like we're just dealing with the stuff that's above the surface. And it's like if you have to look at the whole chunk of ice because it's there. And you have to have methods and time and space to be in touch with that.
Yeah. And even the way that your brain body is constructed, it's in a way that presumably it's believed that the mind is in the cortex, that wrinkly stuff on the top. But the rest of your body is connected with those survival parts of your brain that aren't part of your thinking mind. Because from an evolutionary perspective, you want that connection to be really rapid. You don't want there to be filters and interference, which is a case in order to get to the cortex. Except for one part of the brain, you have to go through a relay called the thalamus. If you want to get to the thinking part of the brain, you have to go through a relay station. Those survival subcortical limbic areas, brainstem stuff that allows us to mobilize and respond very quickly. We don't have that relay. It's instant. We have responded before we have conscious awareness. That's a design feature.
Right. And for better or worse, I mean, that's a good thing we have that, of course, from a safety point of view. but it seems like we stop a process that maybe goes past there. Like we're talking about the shaking and stuff. But I mean, sometimes like I couldn't shake when I was on the ground. When that, it was a physical trauma, it was very obvious trauma, but it caused all this emotional stuckness. But I've had emotional things in my life that manifest themselves through my body, almost as like a way of distracting me, or it's sort of trying to, it's almost like communication isn't happening, so it's coming out in a different way as a form of communication. It's kind of profound and confusing at the same time, but I now know it's like, oh, that's a thing. That's a definite thing.
It's a definite thing, and we see a lot with chronic pain, where when we have a trauma, it like activates a certain sensitivity in the brain and the body, and it can sort of preload us for any additional undesirable experience that comes on top of that. And this is how people get into states of chronic pain. Things really do get stuck in the body. And not just from a hypothetical perspective. It's how we are designed that trauma gets encoded in a body experience. It's not an explicit narrative until we make that narrative up. It gets encoded physically, emotionally in these lower structures.
Yeah.
Before
we run out of time, I just want to circle back to music again. And like, if broadly speaking, is there more we could get into as music as a tool, or music in the brain, music in the body particularly, or maybe even an experience you might have had at Esalen that we could pick apart?
Yeah, well, something that happened to me at Esalen was, and it was during that co-creative, I don't want to give away all your trade secrets, but
no, it's not secrets.
Yeah.
We're doing another retreat in the summer, June 30th through July 4th, 2023.
So, this amazing experience where we all do this co-creative thing with you. And it was profound because I lost my father about 17 years ago, actually this week. And he loved music. I think he's the one that instilled in me my love of music. And he would always say this thing when all of the kids were just ranging and my mom would be like, turn it down. He would be like, and he'd probably have a couple of whiskeys in him at that point. And he'd say, just listen. And you said that morning. And then I just cried for like 2 hours. And I
remember that.
Yep.
Yeah.
I couldn't stop. And it was so cathartic for me because I think what happened, the combination of the music and you saying that, it just transported me. And I think it literally allowed my body to let go of all this grief. We see it a lot with music where people are so emotionally moved. I think music impacts the body in a totally different way because also we know it's like this right brain kind of experience, unlike language, which is, supposedly more of a left brain. I think it like trauma gets encoded in the body. It's like I said, I think it's more powerful than a lot of the research has looked at this point. I think it'd be freaking cool to, like we said, let's get some biometric wearables and check people's HRV during that experience.
I wouldn't mind more research around a lot of this stuff. I think it'd be really interesting. It's probably, in a broader sense, beyond just music. It's something about art and creativity. I had a conversation, the podcast will be coming out in March, with Susan Mag-Salmon, Ivy Ross, around art and the brain. And there's just so much research around like the straight up health benefits in a diversity of forms of almost any kind of creativity. You live longer. I mean, there's actual data. It's crazy. So it's almost like, why are we not paying more attention to this for something that's so natural? And with music, like, bonus, it's also often beautiful and enjoyable. It's not even like, oh, you got to take that bitter medicine. It's no, you can listen to some really cool art and all different flavors of it and have all these benefits.
I think a lot of scientists stay away. I agree. I think a lot of scientists stay away from studying things like art because it's
It's hard to quantify.
It's like so intangible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know who Alan Harvey is? He wrote this great book called Music, Evolution, and the Harmony of Souls.
I don't.
Check it out. You'll love it. And he says, there's a quote in there, lots of quotes, but he says, ask Leonardo da Vinci, was he an artist or a scientist? And he wouldn't understand the question.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite quotes, Basquiat, he says, art is how we decorate space and music's how we decorate time. It's kind of like that, I think.
Yeah, art, creativity, creation is the fundamental aspect of being a human being. I mean, it's what it means to be alive. It's with the way we think, the way we move through the world is a form of creation. It's why we're here. You look at forms of art of any kind, it's just a more magnificent manifestation of that same substrate of energy. And so it's just like asking a fish what water is. It's like sometimes we have to remind ourselves of its power.
Yeah, and I think, again, art is play. Creativity is play. And we know that in order to be in a play state, that is an elevated physiological state. Of course, people are healthier and live longer because they're in a play state. And being in a play state has you in that most elevated of autonomic nervous system platforms. It is the most desirable mode of being in the world.
So would you say, is in summation of what we're talking about today, is it more about play or is it more about feeling or is it sort of the same thing, or am I reducing this too much?
No, I think it is more about play. I think music, in terms of like what is happening in the body and our subjective lived experience, music elevates our state of being to that experience of playfulness. There's no other way to describe it because what is the purpose of music?
That's a hard thing to answer because I could say, I mean, what's great about music is it's transdimensional. It doesn't have one thing. It's metaphorical in a sense. So maybe the purpose is to connect us to that which is beyond the finite.
You used one term, and I love that. And the word that you use that is most resonant for me is connection. Mm-hmm. And what all the science shows is that our ability to connect and the biomarkers of connection sounds kind of creepy, but if we distill it down to the neurochemistry of connection, things like dopamine and oxytocin, these are more elevated with music than not.
Right.
And Alan Harvey in this book says, again, the argument is which came first. He says, maybe music started to evolve in essence alongside language, because as language evolved, individuation started to happen. That it became more about the self and ego, and what music did was bring people back more into pro-social connection. And the science today sort of reflects that.
That's fascinating. That's a fascinating idea. I mean, I wonder if we can track back music. I mean, we found bone flutes and forms of
45,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, we're talking Stone Age stuff as far as I understand it.
Yep.
And so that's crazy to think about. More or less, we have flutes that aren't that different today, and they still have value. And so even when there maybe was less language, there was still like an interest and desire to create music.
Yeah, if someone, what's the purpose of music? I think the purpose of music is elevating our mode of being in the world, and that is enhanced through connection. Connection is the most highest. Connection is a biological imperative. Connection is required to survive. And music takes that to the next level.
It's a celebration of the human spirit. And if connection is required or needed or necessary or fundamental, we live in strange times when we're hyper-connected yet disconnected at the same time. And so it requires that we, put a lot of actual thought into what is real connection for me and how do I exercise that, as opposed to these surface level forms of connection that maybe engender more disconnection.
Yeah, and I think that's where ceremony comes and plays a massive role, because even if you maybe resist going to a ceremony or resist group breath work or, whatever. I mean, I think you'll be hard pressed to not elevate your state of being. It happens. It's not a thought process. It's a body process.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, there is a power to the group experience. And I think that was laid bare through the pandemic. When things get taken away, it becomes a little more obvious. Like, oh, these things that maybe I was doing or you took for granted, how important they are to our well-being. The power of, that's what concerts, why I started doing ceremony concerts and putting the two together, is really just bringing a little of that consciousness into it to amplify the power of the music and the emotional experience of being there. That was it.
Yeah. Why I love having these conversations is because it's not conventional. Like, conventional medicine is not talking about how connection elevates our state of being. And like you said, because of the pandemic, that got removed. And prevalence of things like depression, anxiety, suicide, everything became elevated. And it wasn't just because of stress. It's because we took away the ability to connect with other human beings. And connection is a biological imperative. A baby cannot grow and live and thrive by itself. And even that's not just a matter of food and water. The typical neurosequential development of the brain, it requires physical contact. And you can even measure some of the same chemicals we were talking about. There's so much research. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it all jives together. It's why it's so fun. And to finally start overlaying the impact of music, which is like this, it's across every culture. There's not a culture exists. There's no ethnicity. Everybody uses it somehow. And yet it's not a language, but it's certainly a form of communication.
Is there any research or any indication of like the ways to engage with music in a, it's better than another? Or I know when you make music from that Art on Brain book, it was like just listening to it's one thing. It's great. When you go to the next level and you start singing and participating, the next level maybe with the group, and the next level like quote unquote improvising.
Yeah.
It just keeps lighting up more and more areas.
Definitely. I would say, if you're a little bit scared about diving into music, start by singing in your car when you're by yourself. Anything. Yeah. I think that's going to...
Humming feels good, yeah.
And that literally stimulates the vagus nerve in this area, which again, elevates our state. This isn't all... I just want to... Maybe I want to convey something I want to leave with people is like, what we're talking about here is not conjecture. Like, there's science behind this conversation. And even though it might be the first time people are hearing it, just know that it's real. And music. Well, music and psychedelics is...
It's like, talk about next level. It's undescribable. I mean, I think most people listening to this have probably had some kind of experience in their life with that combination. That the fact that like we can even be graced with that in this life, it's so unreal that I've basically devoted my life to it because it was just realer than real,
Yeah, and the level of change that you can instigate in a moment, it's like nothing else you could possibly experience.
Yeah. I feel like that's a great place to close. I think the takeaway for me here is sort of what I was walking in with, which is just continued dedication to listening to my body and learning the language of that communication, which has always been there. It's just sort of me allowing it to happen and giving it space and time, because it's really important. I can tell, and I want to keep those wavelengths open, the channels of communication open, because I don't want things to be stuck. I want to be free.
Yeah, and when we work through the body, we can get unstuck in ways that is not possible through the mind. So I just encourage everybody to find a place to jump in and, yeah.
Well, how do folks jump in with you? What's going on in your world, or what's the best method?
They can. I've got a couple of websites. Our foundation website, which is pranafound.org, and I do breath workshops here in Half Moon Bay. We do retreats in Costa Rica. They can find me through pranafound.org or through my own website, which is drmoniqueandrews.com.
Well, thank you, Monique, for taking the time to chat. I enjoyed it, and good to see you again, and hope we can do it again.
Yeah, thanks, brother.
Thanks, Dr. Mo, for coming on the show. I very much enjoyed that. Hope to see you again at Esalen or elsewhere. Esalen, the December retreat, I believe, is sold out. But, sometimes somebody has to drop and then a little spot pops up, and we're working on looking at places that we could add other kinds of retreats just to give us all more opportunities to gather. So again, stay tuned. Newsletter is a great way because those spots often go quickly, and we love to give different opportunities to gather as a community. This song that you're hearing in the background is called Journey to the Holy Well. It is from the new album Burren, my collaborative album with Peter Broderick. Thanks for all the words of support, hearing about some folks out there who are really enjoying listening to this album. I'm glad you are, because as you know, if you've listened to this podcast, it was just a magical experience making it. We're very proud of it, and we're so happy it's out there reverberating in the world. Very soon, this month, Peter and I, we did that live stream on the winter solstice. I remixed that entire 4-hour ceremony and recut the entire video. It looks awesome. It sounds amazing. We're going to put that back up online soon. More info coming. Stay tuned. And thank you to everyone on our council who supports this podcast. You can do so at patreon.com/eastforest. Join our monthly council. Listen to demos and unreleased music, among other things. Patreon.com/eastforest. You guys keep walking your walk. Don't take any shit, but if you do, you know what to do. Just do it with grace.